Welcome back. This is the second part of the lecture on why does college cost so much. In this lecture, I want to focus on theoretical explanations. And you know that where we started last time was to review this idea that since at least 1949, tuition increases have outpaced other increases in the cost of living. That the impact of that over decades is not only dramatic, but really terrible. It makes college so expensive that families are now questioning whether they can afford to go at all. So we've reviewed a number of hypotheses about why college costs so much. We talked about mismanagement, more expensive educational programs, increased government regulations, cultural shifts and expectations for services, administrative bloat. Now we want to focus on theoretical explanations that include unrestrained efforts to increase quality and Baumol's cost disease. There are two primary theoretical frameworks that are out there that I am familiar with. The first is Bowen's revenue theory, first published in 1980, and the second, much more recent, is Archibald and Feldman's arguments for Baumol's cost disease. We're going to start with Bowen, and we're going to really strip it down to its basics. There are four basic ideas here. First of all, Bowen argues that all educational institutions aspire to excellence. I checked that out by looking at mission statements from a variety of colleges and universities. They're so easy to find. University of California, a vision for excellence. University of Illinois is about being excellent. If we look at some private schools, University of San Francisco embraces Jesuit values that are focused on academic excellence. At University of Toledo, they're all about excellence in learning. At University of Central Arkansas, they are committed to excellence. At UCLA, they strive for excellence. And the point through all of this is that lots of different kinds of colleges and universities talk about what Bowen said was the basic aspiration of higher education, striving for excellence. You've got flagship state universities like University of Maryland and University of Illinois. You've got very large research universities like UCLA. And then you've got University of Toledo. You've got University of Central Arkansas. So these are not schools that fit with U of I or University of Maryland or UCLA. You've got a very broad range of institutions, all of which are, quote, focused on excellence. Second, Bowen argues that excellence is an ill-defined horizon concept. How do you know when you've become excellent? There is no indicator that would be a broadly accepted indicator of excellence. I think we all think that, say, Stanford is an excellent university. Well, what makes it excellent? We could probably come up with 20 different things. If I asked each of you to write down 5 things that make Stanford excellent, I'm not sure we would agree. Well, because excellence is a horizon concept, then there's no end of money that you can throw at that. Institutions raise all the money they can. They charge all they can, so they can throw it at the pursuit of excellence. I think that's illustrated by the fact that there are lots of universities that have centers. A center, say Wheaton College has the Billy Graham Center. At Bethel Seminary, we have the Corey Center, which is focused on child and family ministry. These are programs that we start, possibly because a donor is interested in it, possibly because it helps advance the name of the university, possibly because it is a thing that we can say leads us to excellence. Once you start a center, it's really hard to cut a center. Once you start an academic program, it's really hard to cut a program. And one of the jokes that I've heard over and over and over is that if you want eternal life, come back as an academic program. Insert laugh here. This idea that colleges and universities are very reticent to cut any major at all, and we've talked about that, we'll talk about that. Well, the fourth idea associated with Bowen is that there's no incentive for profit, right? You're not returning money to shareholders. You're not returning profit to the president or the key constituents on the board. What you're committed to is being more and more excellent. How do you know that you're excellent? Well, if you've got a really big budget and you throw it at really big ideas, really big things, great research, great faculty, great facilities, nice jacuzzis, wonderful physical plant. And so the result is that costs continually go up. you've got this horizon concept, this idea that you're striving for excellence. There's no way to know that you've ever reached it. You're not trying to distribute profit, and therefore you plow all the costs back into the university. And you do that typically by asking for tuition dollars. You also ask donors to pony up to help support it. But there's no end to how much spending a college or university can do, and there's no incentive to save because more spending suggests a way to get to a higher level of excellence. So that's Bowen for basic principles, and we're going to come back to that in a little bit. But first, let's cover cost disease. Cost disease comes out of this guy, William J. Baumol, or Bill Baumol, an economist who argued that greater productivity in the generation of goods drives down the cost of those goods, but it has a side effect of driving up pay. So think about the example that is in the textbook or the book that you read on clothing costs. The Industrial Revolution really changed the way that clothing is manufactured. We went from basically tailors to machines. And as those machines were created, the ability to pump out clothing was dramatically increased, and the cost of generating any specific piece of clothing went way down. So socks became very cheap. But the technology drove pay raises because you had to bring in a more educated workforce. As we've gone from the Industrial Revolution to the Information Revolution and computing technology, we now have programmed machines to create the clothing that we wear. And it's really driven down costs. New York Times, in a 2008 article, talked about how between 1998 and 2008, the cost of manufactured clothing on average dropped about 10% in inflation-adjusted dollars. Technology created increases in productivity, but that productivity drove up pay because you had to bring in a more educated workforce. When wage pressure grows and productivity remains relatively constant, cost disease exists. So in environments where you operate, where technology does not increase the productivity in that sector, there's still wage pressure. We'll come back to this idea in a little bit. But it's a complicated idea, it's an important idea, and I believe it's a central part of higher education cost structures. So it's important that you understand this. When wage pressure grows but productivity remains relatively constant, there's cost disease. The example that people always use when talking about cost disease is a string quartet. How do you become more productive in getting more music out of a string quartet? You can't reduce the number of people in a string quartet. But how much you pay members of a string quartet is driven by cultural factors. If everybody's making $100,000 a year, you better be paying string quartet members $100,000 a year, or they're going to decide they don't need to be part of a string quartet. So the classic example in Baumol's cost disease is the string quartet example, where wage pressure exists to pay quartet members more, but there's no way to increase productivity by reducing the number of employees in that string quartet. It stops being a string quartet. Now, productivity can be increased in lots of ways, but in our culture, technological advances generally are what drive up productivity increases. And every time you have a technological advance, you also need to bring in an educated workforce, and that educated workforce increases the pressure on wages. Educated people, on average, get paid more. So productivity increases drive profit that can be plowed into pay, and that is needed because you need a more educated workforce. Technology is actually quite expensive. And in education, technology does not have a uniformly positive impact on learning. Think about how technology works in higher education. Does it actually make learning more efficient? Have we increased the production of learning by introducing technology into higher education? Certainly the answer is complicated. You're studying online, and so arguably it's helping. But 20 years ago, you would have been in a classroom learning this information. We're not actually reaching more people through this class, through technology, We are simply providing the same learning through technology. Think about how technology works in other ways in higher education. You provide smart classrooms to learn in. Could you learn as well in a classroom that wasn't a smart classroom? Probably. But in our culture, we can't. There's also technology that's required to store student records. There's technology required to ensure the security of the campus. There's all kinds of technology costs that do not improve the rate at which students learn. Learning does not get much faster or better because we have introduced technology into higher education in many cases. In some cases, technology does facilitate learning. In some cases, it's necessary for learning. But there's no uniformly positive effect on learning through technology. And in fact, in higher education, technology has essentially the opposite effect relative to the production of manufactured goods. In manufactured goods, technology increases both productivity and quality, and clothing is a great example of that. Better clothing is produced, more uniformly good quality clothing is produced through technology. But do we uniformly produce smarter, more knowledgeable students because we have computers in a classroom? Arguably, no. In this slide, entitled Tech-Fueled Cost Disease, what I want to focus on is a graphic of how cost disease works in manufacturing versus higher education. And the top part of this is focused on manufacturing. In manufacturing, you start out with the production of goods, and to facilitate the production of goods, you adopt better technology. As you adopt better technology, you increase the productive output. As you increase production, you have more things to sell, and that increases revenue. That allows you to bring in a more educated workforce that can run the technology. Once you've brought the educated workforce in, wages will inevitably rise. So in the manufacturing sector, you adopt technology, you increase production, that brings about more money that you've got available, and that causes wages to rise, which is good because you need an educated workforce to operate the machines that are producing the increased production. Now compare that to what's going on in higher education. In higher education, you are producing professional services, that is, by and large, you're trying to help people learn. That's the product that we're providing. You adopt technology to facilitate that, arguably, because everybody's doing it, and because in some cases you have to have technology, say in the STEM fields. It also facilitates communication. It does a lot of good things for higher education. But it does not increase learning. It does not change the rate at which people learn. It does not necessarily increase the number of people who learn. And so the adoption of technology only leads to stable production or, in some cases, reduced production. That means there's no change in revenue. It's possible, in fact, that because you've adopted technology, your revenue is declining. Certainly your net revenue is declining because the cost of producing education has gone up. Now, education always requires an educated workforce. So there's no change in the need for an educated workforce by adopting technology. It's not like manufacturing, which historically operated without an educated workforce and only needed an educated workforce because of technology. But when manufacturing was able to increase pay, that put competitive pressure on other sectors of the economy, causing wages to rise. And so, in spite of the fact that technology costs more but does not have any increase in learning or learning outcomes, arguably, in most cases, wage pressure still exists, and wages have had to rise in higher education. And so the cost of paying a faculty member is simply different now than it was 40 years ago in inflation-adjusted terms. Faculty are more expensive because, why? Wage pressure that's come from other sectors of the economy. And because faculty make up the majority of the costs of any university, that is, the salaries of those faculty, make up the majority of cost in any university, you have wage pressure to pay them more, and that's driven, arguably, because of Baumol's cost disease. Wage pressure coming from the adoption of technology in sectors other than higher education that has resulted in increased costs for a faculty that still teaches the same number of students, still expects to teach the same number of courses in a given year, but now we have to pay more in order to bring them in. Now, it's not just the faculty, but it's arguably the administrators and others who are also experiencing the desire for higher wages. How many times have you heard people say, my school just doesn't have competitive salaries? Well, it certainly is trying to have competitive salaries, and those salaries are higher than they would have been 40 years ago in inflation-adjusted terms because of the pressure that exists outside of higher education to increase wages. So, is Baumol's theory right? That is, are Archibald and Feldman right? Or is Bowen right? Here's what Archibald and Feldman say. If the revenue theory of costs or other higher education-specific explanations have great explanatory power, costs in higher education should follow an idiosyncratic time path. Think about that statement for a little bit. On the other hand, if the cost disease explanation dominates, the time path of costs in higher education should be very similar to the time path of costs in industries that share the characteristics of creating cost disease. What are those industries that share the characteristics of creating cost disease? They are professional service industries. What are professional service industries? Being a physician, being a dentist, being an attorney. In all of those cases, you've got one person delivering service to a small number of others. In the case of a professor, you've got a professor teaching 20 students in a class. In the case of a physician, you've got a physician that can see 10 patients a day or 8 patients a day. In the case of an attorney, you've got an attorney that can deal with a relatively small number of clients at any one time. In all of those cases, you've got a well-educated person who is serving a relatively small number of people. What's the cost history for those industries? Well, there's this remarkable graph from Why Does College Cost So Much that shows remarkable similarity in wage rates relative to inflation for higher education, so for pay for professors, pay for dentists, pay for physicians, and pay for legal services. The similarity of those lines across time is really the argument that Archibald and Feldman make for why cost disease is applicable to higher education. And if we looked at other industries, we would see a very different set of graphs. So if we look at costs in the sector of manufacturing, especially clothing manufacturing, you don't see anything like that same wage structure over time. It's the differentiation also, not just the similarities between profs, physicians, dentists, and attorneys that makes the case. It's the differentiation between professors and people who work in manufacturing. There is really pretty good evidence that Baumol's cost disease plays some role in the upswing in tuition fee, room, and board costs for students over the 40 years, or arguably since 1949. If Baumol's cost disease is true, that is, if it's external wage pressure driven by technological advances that increase productivity in other sectors that drive up wage costs in higher education, what that allows us to say is, hey, it's not our fault. It's wage pressure coming at us from advancements made in other industries. It's not our fault we're so expensive. It's that clothing manufacturing has put wage pressure on professors. Now, I'm obviously oversimplifying there, but the conclusion is somewhat comforting to say that it's really a lot of factors external to higher education that are driving up the costs in higher education. The problem with that explanation, however, is that the only response that we can make to it is we've got to change the number of students that we can educate by using technology. right? We've got to cut professors out of the equation. And that's a disturbing conclusion. If Baumol's cost disease is right, then we either need to jack up the student-faculty ratio to an absurd number, like 100 to 1, or we need to somehow use technology in a way that cuts out the contributions of faculty in direct service to students. And that's not comforting either, because most people who are professors go into higher education because they really want to connect to students. They're passionate about teaching. If Baumol's cost disease is right, the professorate is going to look very different in 50 years than it does now, because technology is going to have to change the ratio of number of students to number of faculty in order to drive down costs. It's an interesting place that we are in higher education right now. Where does that leave us? There are at least 5 reasons why costs in higher education have grown dramatically. Regulation plays a role, few percentage points in cost. Added services play a role. It's certainly the case that we have added services to most colleges and universities in the United States. As a result of that, and as a result of academic differentiation, there's been a growth in administration across time that drives up costs in significant ways. There is a continuous quest for excellence. It's a horizon concept that universities will likely always chase. We want to be excellent. And it's not just Stanford that wants to be excellent. It's also Podunk U in the middle of Arkansas, perhaps. I apologize for any negative reference to Arkansas. In addition, it is technology-fueled cost disease that has introduced wage pressure, technological cost, but has not increased the productivity of student learning. It's Baumol's cost disease, I think, that made people so excited about massive open online courses a few years ago. If you can have 100,000 students in an online class and you've got one professor delivering education to those 100,000, that solves Baumol's cost disease for higher ed. Of course, the problem is that MOOCs don't work. 99% of the people drop out of the course, and those that stay in the course, it's not clear exactly what they learn. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with some problems. It's not easy to get rid of regulation. We can't shunt or shed added services because students expect them. If we have added services and we have differentiation of academic programs, we need a healthy administration. We are not likely to stop questing for excellence because there is really no other indicator of academic quality. And there's no way to get rid of technology-fueled cost disease that is apparent to people in the United States right now. We hope these things change, but right now, the problem with the increase in costs of tuition fee, room and board is complicated, contributed to by at least 5 factors, and none of those factors are simple to fix. We're talking about the need for significant change in higher education. Unless there is a really substantial change in the way we do business, that is, the way we teach courses, or unless cultural values shift in ways that we can't control, we can anticipate continued cost growth that will outpace inflation for the foreseeable future. And it's also possible that that's going to outpace family incomes to the point where college and universities will have a very difficult time surviving because people won't be able to afford it. It's not a happy picture that I'm describing. The challenge is real. Higher education does face, a long history of dramatic increases in cost. Those costs happen for at least 5 reasons that are hard to control, and there's no remarkable change on the horizon that we can see. I'm sorry to say that not very happy conclusion is the end of this lecture, but it does give you a lot to think about as we think about ways to improve university education in the future. It is the next generation of students that will be asked to solve these problems as we continue to work on them. I look forward to connecting with you on these ideas, and that is the end of this lecture, Why Does College Cost So Much? Talk to you next time.